In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. This phrase has echoed through countless battles, across innumerable worlds, defining the very essence of existence in the 41st millennium. It is a universe where compassion is weakness, where mercy invites destruction, and where the concept of peaceful coexistence between species belongs to a forgotten age that will never return. Within this merciless cosmos, few scenarios seem more impossible, more fundamentally contrary to the natural order of things, than an orc being raised by humans. To understand just how improbable this situation truly is, we must first grasp the depths of humanity's hatred for the alien. The Imperium of man, that sprawling galactic empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds, has built its entire civilization on a foundation of xenophobia so profound that it becomes almost religious in nature. The imperial creed, preached from countless pulpits across the galaxy by the Adeptus Ministorum, declares with absolute certainty that humanity alone has been chosen by the God Emperor to inherit the stars. Every alien species, from the craft world Aeldari to the ambitious Tau, represents not merely an enemy to be defeated, but an abomination to be purged from existence itself. To suffer the alien to live is considered not just foolish, but heretical, a betrayal of humanity's divine mandate that can only be answered with the purifying flame of the Imperium's wrath. The orcs stand among the most reviled of all Xenos races in the eyes of the Imperium. These green-skinned monsters have plagued humanity since before recorded history, their endless hordes sweeping across worlds like a biological tide that cannot be stemmed. Imperial scholars estimate that orcs may well outnumber humanity itself, despite the Imperium's 1,000,000 worlds and countless trillions of souls. They are a plague upon the galaxy, a cancer that spreads wherever they touch down, impossible to fully eradicate once their spores have taken root in a world's soil. Planetary governors understand the terrible truth that even a single orc killed on their world means that decades or centuries hence, their descendants may face feral orc tribes emerging from the wilderness, requiring eternal vigilance and regular culling operations that drain resources and claim lives with depressing regularity. Yet for all their threat to humanity, orcs represent something even more fundamentally alien than most Xenos species, where the Aeldari can be understood through their arrogance and their tragic fall, where the Tau's naive optimism about the greater good provides at least a framework for comprehension. Orcs exist on a level that defies human understanding. They are not merely another intelligent species that happens to be hostile. They are weapons given life, biological war machines engineered in the ancient mists of prehistory by the mysterious Old Ones, created for the sole purpose of waging eternal conflict. Violence is not merely their culture or their preference, but their fundamental biological imperative, woven into every cell of their hybrid animal-fungus physiology. An orc does not fight to survive or to achieve goals. An orc fights because fighting is what an orc is. It would be easier to teach a fire not to burn than to pacify an orc. Beyond their biological nature, orcs possess something that makes them even more incomprehensible to human minds. They are a psychic race, though not in the traditional sense. Every orc generates and contributes to a gestalt psychic field, an unconscious collective power that grows stronger with every green skin that gathers in one place. This field, which the orcs themselves simply call the battle cry, allows them to instinctively recognize hierarchy, to make their ramshackle technology function through sheer collective belief, and to draw upon a wellspring of psychic might that makes them more dangerous the more numerous they become. It is a power they do not understand and cannot control individually. Yet it defines every aspect of their existence, from the structure of their society to the function of their weapons. A human can never truly think like an orc, because human consciousness is fundamentally individual, while orc consciousness exists in a state of permanent partial connection to every other member of their species. So we must confront the central question of this exploration with full awareness of its absurdity. What would it mean for an orc to be raised by humans? How could such a scenario even come to pass in a galaxy where humans hunt orcs with religious fervor, and where orcs see humans as nothing more than particularly entertaining enemies to fight? What psychological and biological transformations would occur in an orc consciousness developing without the Gestalt field? Without the constant violence that drives orc growth, without any other member of their species to provide context for their instincts? And perhaps most profoundly, what would it mean for an orc to be human in everything but biology, to carry the values and perspectives of mankind in a body designed for eternal war? This is not a tale of redemption, for orcs have nothing from which to be redeemed. It is not a story of taming the savage, for the term savage implies a lack of sophistication that does not apply to a species whose biological engineering surpasses anything the Imperium can create. Rather, this is an exploration of identity, consciousness, and the fundamental question of whether nature or nurture defines who we are. In a galaxy where breeding, genetics, and purity of bloodline determine one's place in society, where the very concept of deviation from one's genetic heritage is seen as corrupting and dangerous, an orc raised as human represents something profoundly disturbing to the Imperium's worldview. It suggests that even the most alien consciousness might be shaped by environment and experience, that the rigid categories by which the Imperium orders its universe might be more permeable than dogma allows. We will examine this impossible scenario from every angle, beginning with the biological realities of orc physiology and working our way through the developmental stages such a being would experience. We will explore the psychological landscape of a mind caught between two incompatible ways of being, the social challenges of existing as an outsider in human society, and the constant internal struggle between genetic imperatives and learned values. We will consider the implications for both species and what this scenario tells us about the nature of consciousness itself in the grim darkness of the far future. This journey will take us to uncomfortable places, confronting us with questions that the Imperium would rather remain unasked, examining possibilities that dogma insists cannot exist. So let us begin this exploration of the impossible, this thought experiment that violates everything the Imperium holds sacred. Let us imagine what it would be like to be an orc adopted by humans, understanding from the start that we are venturing into territory where biology, psychology, and philosophy collide in ways that challenge our understanding of what it means to be a person in the 41st millennium. Understanding orc biology, what makes them fundamentally different? Before we can meaningfully explore the experience of an orc raised by humans, we must first understand exactly what an orc is at the most fundamental biological level. The Magos biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus have studied captured orc specimens for millennia, and their findings paint a picture of a species so alien in its construction that it challenges every assumption about how life should function. The orcs are not simply another species that evolved along different lines from humanity. They are something far stranger, a deliberate creation whose biology reflects the purposes for which they were designed. At the most basic level, an orc is a symbiosis of two entirely different forms of life that have been merged so seamlessly that they function as a single organism. The animal component provides mobility, consciousness, and the aggressive predator instincts that drive orc behavior. The fungal component provides resilience, rapid growth, and perhaps, most importantly, the reproductive mechanism that makes orcs the most successful invasive species in the galaxy. These two aspects live in such perfect harmony that an orc's body represents something unique in the galaxy, neither purely animal nor purely fungal, but both simultaneously in ways that defy conventional biological classification. The most immediately striking feature of any orc is their green skin, a coloration that extends through their entire integumentary system down to the cellular level. This green tone is not merely pigmentation, as Imperial scholars initially assumed, but rather the result of chlorophyll present throughout their tissues. Yes, orcs can photosynthesize, drawing energy directly from light in addition to their consumption of food. This gives them an extraordinary advantage in sustained campaigns, as orc armies require far fewer supply lines than human forces. While an Imperial Guard regiment needs constant shipments of rations, water, and medical supplies, an orc mob can sustain itself for extended periods with minimal food, their bodies producing energy from whatever light is available. This photosynthetic ability means that starving out an orc infestation is effectively impossible, one of many factors that make the greenskins so difficult to eradicate once they have established themselves on a world. The orc's internal anatomy reflects a philosophy of brutal simplicity taken to its logical extreme. Where humans possess a complex array of organs, each performing specialized functions vital to survival, orcs have simplified their internal structure to focus entirely on resilience and combat effectiveness. Their digestive system consists of a large multi-chambered stomach, feeding into a crude but effective renal system, both of which are supported and supplemented by what Magos biologists describe as fungal soup that fills much of their body cavity. This fungal matter serves the functions that would be performed by a liver, kidneys, spleen, and pancreas in a human, but does so through biochemical processes that are far more robust and less vulnerable to damage. The implications of this simplified internal structure are profound. Where a human can be killed or incapacitated by damage to any of dozens of vital organs, an orc has far fewer critical points. A wound that would be immediately fatal to a human might be merely inconvenient to an orc. Their simplified circulatory system means they can lose tremendous amounts of blood without going into shock. Their distributed organ functions mean that there is no single point of failure. Even their brain, while large and complex, is more resistant to damage than a human brain due to the way it is structured vertically rather than horizontally and protected by a skull that is significantly thicker than human bone. Speaking of bones, the orc skeleton represents another marvel of biological engineering. Orc bones are extraordinarily thick and dense compared to human bones, giving them both impressive durability and the structural support necessary for their massive musculature. But what makes orc bones truly remarkable is not their density, but what they contain. Rather than the marrow found in human bones, orc bones are filled with spongy fungal matter that serves multiple purposes. This fungal core makes the bones more flexible and resistant to shattering, while also providing another distributed system for producing the various biochemicals the orc body needs. An orc can survive impacts that would shatter a human skeleton, their fungal-enhanced bones absorbing and distributing force in ways that defy conventional biomechanics. The muscular system of an orc is perhaps their most obvious advantage over humans. Even a relatively small orc boy possesses strength far exceeding that of an unaugmented human, and as orcs grow larger through combat success, their strength increases proportionally. This musculature is not merely larger, but structured differently, with muscle fibers that are denser and more efficient than human muscle tissue. An orc's physical power comes not just from having more muscle, but from having better muscle, tissue that can generate and sustain force levels that would cause human muscle to tear itself apart. Combined with their simplified nervous system that does not bother with the complex proprioception and fine motor control that humans possess, orcs can exert their full strength without the limiters that prevent humans from injuring themselves. But perhaps the most alien aspect of orc biology is their method of reproduction, if it can even be called that. Orcs do not reproduce through any sexual process. They have no concept of gender, no mating rituals, no childhood dependency on parents. Instead, throughout their lives, orcs constantly release microscopic spores from their bodies, shedding these reproductive units with every breath and particularly in great clouds when they die violently. These spores fall to the ground, burrow into the soil, and begin a growth cycle that will eventually produce not just new orcs, but an entire ecosystem of orcoid life forms. The spore cycle begins with the smallest organisms, squigs and snotlings, which emerge first and begin establishing the foundation of orc society. Squigs are small, mobile fungal animal hybrids that serve as everything from food sources to living ammunition, while snotlings, despite their limited intelligence, instinctively cultivate fungal crops and maintain the squig populations. Next come the Gretchen, or grots, slightly more intelligent than snotlings and capable of basic tool use and organization. Gretchen build the first crude settlements and perform the labor that will support the orcs when they finally emerge. Finally, the orcs themselves sprout, emerging as fully formed beings that already possess significant size and basic knowledge encoded in their genes. This reproductive method has staggering implications. A single dead orc can spawn an entire ecosystem that might eventually produce hundreds or thousands of orcs over the course of decades or centuries. Even if an orc invasion is completely defeated, even if every single greenskin is hunted down and killed, their spores remain in the soil, waiting. Some worlds that successfully repelled orc invasions in the distant past still deal with feral orc tribes emerging from their wilderness regions thousands of years later. The only certain way to eliminate an orc infestation is through exterminatus, the complete destruction of a world's ability to support life, and even this is not always permanent if spores can survive in deep caverns or other protected environments. The final piece of orc biology that we must understand is their growth mechanism, which differs radically from human development. Humans grow according to a predetermined genetic program, reaching adult size in their late teens and remaining relatively stable thereafter. Orcs, by contrast, never stop growing. More specifically, orcs grow in direct response to combat success and social dominance. When an orc wins fights, when they earn the respect of other orcs, when they establish themselves as powerful and dangerous, their bodies respond by growing larger and stronger. This is not merely a matter of adding muscle mass through exercise. The orc's entire physiology scales up, their bones thickening, their organs expanding, their skin toughening, all driven by biochemical processes tied to their success in violence. This growth mechanism means that the biggest orcs are always the most successful orcs, the ones who have proven themselves through countless battles. A war boss stands head and shoulders above their boys, not because they were born different, but because they have won more fights, killed more enemies, and established dominance over other orcs. Some particularly successful war bosses grow to truly enormous sizes, becoming beings of such physical might that they can tear apart armored vehicles with their bare hands. During the War of the Beast, the largest orc war boss ever recorded, known simply as the Beast, grew to a size rivaling Imperial knights, standing several stories tall and possessing strength that defied belief. This was not mutation or chaos corruption, but simply orc biology taken to its natural extreme. This growth is tied intrinsically to the Gestalt psychic field that all orcs generate and contribute to. The field allows orcs to instinctively recognize who is bigger, and therefore who deserves respect and obedience. It creates a natural hierarchy without need for complex social structures or bureaucracy. The biggest orc is in charge because every other orc can feel on a psychic level that they are bigger. And the act of being recognized as bigger triggers further growth, creating a positive feedback loop where success breeds size and size breeds success. An orc raised in isolation from other orcs would be cut off from this fundamental aspect of their biology. Their growth stunted not by lack of nutrition, but by lack of psychic validation from their own kind. Finally, we must consider the genetic knowledge that orcs possess, a feature that makes them uniquely dangerous. Unlike humans, who must learn virtually everything about their society and technology through education and experience, orcs have certain types of knowledge hard-coded into their genes. Mech boys, the orc engineers, do not learn to build machines. The knowledge simply emerges in their minds as they grow, an instinctive understanding of how to assemble functional technology from scrap. Pain boys, the orc medics, possess innate surgical knowledge that allows them to perform operations that would kill any other species, but somehow work on orc physiology. This genetic knowledge means that even feral orc tribes, completely cut off from advanced technology, will eventually develop their own mech boys and begin building crude but functional weapons and vehicles. This is the biological reality of an orc. They are photosynthesizing fungal animal hybrids that reproduce through spores, possess simplified but incredibly resilient internal organs, grow continuously in response to combat success, and carry genetic knowledge that requires no education to access. They are beings designed from the cellular level up to be the perfect soldiers, creatures for whom war is not a choice or a necessity, but the fundamental expression of their existence. To imagine such a being raised in peace, taught human values, separated from the gestalt field that defines orc consciousness, is to imagine something that violates the very design specifications of the species. And yet, in exploring this impossibility, we may learn truths about both orcs and humans that would otherwise remain hidden. The origin story. How could this even happen? Given everything we understand about both orc biology and imperial society, the question naturally arises: how could an orc possibly end up being adopted and raised by humans? What chain of events could lead to a scenario that violates every principle the Imperium holds sacred? While the probability of such an occurrence is vanishingly small, we can construct plausible scenarios that might result in this impossible situation, each revealing something about the cracks in the Imperium's monolithic facade. The most likely origin begins not with full-grown orcs, but with the spore cycle itself. Imagine a frontier world, one of countless millions scattered across the Imperium's vast expanse, a planet where humanity clings to existence far from the centers of imperial power. Such worlds often have small populations, limited resources, and minimal presence of imperial authorities. The local PDF forces might number only a few thousand. The closest Adeptus Mechanicus outpost might be several systems away, and visits from the Ecclesiarchy or Inquisition might occur only once per generation or not at all. On such a world, surrounded by wilderness that remains unmapped and unexplored, unusual events can occur without immediate imperial intervention. This world, let us call it Thalassa Minor, suffered an orc incursion decades or even centuries ago. The invasion was repelled, the greenskins driven back, and eventually exterminated through a brutal campaign that cost thousands of lives, but ultimately succeeded in eliminating every visible orc on the planet. The imperial authorities declared the world cleansed. The Mechanicus conducted their standard purification protocols on the primary battlefields, and life returned to normal. But as we have discussed, orc spores remain in the soil for indefinite periods, and in the deep wilderness, far from human habitation, the orcoid life cycle began anew. In a cave system deep in the northern mountains, where no human had ventured in living memory, orc spores that had lain dormant for decades finally matured. Squigs emerged first, followed by snotlings, then Gretchen, and finally a small population of orcs themselves. These were feral orcs, lacking any connection to the broader orc culture, without access to the technology or knowledge that more developed orc societies possess. They lived as primitive hunter-gatherers, fighting among themselves and the local predators, slowly building toward the critical mass that would allow them to form a proper tribe. But the isolation and small numbers meant their development remained slow, their growth stunted by lack of proper opposition. Into this situation walks our adoptive human family. They might be explorers, cartographers mapping the mountains for the administratum. They might be prospectors searching for mineral deposits in the deep caves. They might be criminals, fleeing justice and seeking a place where imperial authority cannot reach. Or they might simply be settlers, hardy pioneers, establishing a homestead in the wilderness, far from the crowded and controlled environments of the main settlements. Whatever their reason for being so far from civilization, they represent the kind of humans who exist on the edges of imperial society, where dogma meets necessity and pragmatism sometimes must outweigh doctrine. The discovery occurs by accident. Perhaps they stumble upon the cave system while sheltering from a storm. Perhaps they are investigating strange sounds or following an animal they wounded while hunting. What they find horrifies them at first: a nest of orcoid life. Gretchen scurrying in the darkness, the unmistakable green skin of young orcs visible in the depths of the cavern. Any loyal imperial citizen knows what must be done. Report the infestation to the authorities, call for an extermination force, purge the Xenos before they can grow strong enough to threaten the settlements. This is the Emperor's will, clearly stated in doctrine and law. But consider their position. They are days or weeks of travel from the nearest settlement. They have no Vox communication capable of reaching the authorities. If they report the orcs, an extermination force will take months to arrive, and in the meantime, the greenskins will grow stronger. More pragmatically, an extermination force means imperial attention, means officials asking questions about why these people are so far from proper authority, means investigations into their backgrounds and purposes. For settlers trying to escape oversight, for criminals fleeing their past, for rogue traders operating on the margins of legality, drawing imperial scrutiny might be more dangerous than the orc nest. So they face a choice. They cannot simply ignore the infestation. It will eventually grow into a threat. They cannot easily report it without consequences for themselves. What they can do, what hard, practical frontier folk might choose to do, is handle it themselves. They gather weapons, prepare fire and explosives, and descend into the caves to purge the orcoid presence personally. The Gretchen are easily dispatched. The young orcs, only recently emerged and still small by greenskin standards, fall to sustained fire. The tunnels are collapsed with carefully placed charges, burying the remaining spores under tons of rock that should prevent any future sprouting. And then, in the aftermath of the killing, they find something that gives them pause. Deep in the caves, protected behind a boulder in a small alcove, they discover an orc that is somehow different from the others they killed. This one is younger, smaller, barely the size of a large human child. While the others attacked with typical orc ferocity, this one cowered, its behavior more resembling a frightened animal than a greenskin warrior. Perhaps it was the runt of the group, bullied by its larger kin and driven into hiding. Perhaps some genetic quirk in the spore that spawned it resulted in different developmental timing. Perhaps pure chance placed it in a location where the sounds of slaughter and the smell of death triggered a fear response that should not exist in orc psychology, but somehow does in this particular individual. What happens next defies everything the Imperium teaches about Xenos. A rational imperial citizen would kill this creature immediately, understanding that any orc will eventually grow into a threat. But these are not rational imperial citizens in the formal sense. These are people operating at the edges of imperial society, making decisions based on immediate circumstances rather than distant dogma. And looking at this small, frightened creature, some of them see not a greenskin monster, but something that resembles a child in distress. The debate among them is fierce. Some advocate for immediate execution, arguing that this is a Xenos and must be destroyed regardless of its current size or behavior. Others point out that it is young enough, small enough, that perhaps it could be controlled, trained, made useful. On a frontier world where every able body matters for survival, where labor is precious and threats are constant, the idea of a being with orc strength bound to human service holds practical appeal. Still others, particularly if children are present in the group, simply cannot bring themselves to kill something that looks so vulnerable, so lost, so much like an orphaned child, despite its green skin and alien features. In the end, whether out of pragmatism or misplaced compassion or simple curiosity, they make a decision that will change everything. They take the young orc with them. They bind it securely, keep it under constant watch, treat it initially as a dangerous animal that must be controlled. But as days pass during their journey back to their settlement, something shifts. The young orc does not display the aggression they expect. It seems confused, disoriented, almost eager for any interaction that does not involve violence. When offered food, it eats docilely. When spoken to, even in a language it cannot possibly understand, it tilts its head and appears to listen. When the smallest human child approaches despite warnings, the orc does not attack, but instead seems curious, gentle even, in a way that contradicts everything humans believe about greenskins. By the time they reach their home, they have made an unconscious decision. This creature, whatever it is, whatever it might become, will be raised as one of them. They tell themselves it is practical, that having an orc under their control will provide protection and labor. They tell themselves it is an experiment, testing whether the xenos can be domesticated. They tell themselves many things to justify what they know is heresy, what they know would result in their execution if imperial authorities ever discovered the truth. But beneath all the rationalization lies a simpler reality. They have found an orphaned being, and their human instinct to care for the vulnerable has overcome their conditioning to hate the alien. This is how it begins, not through grand planning or deliberate rebellion against imperial doctrine, but through a series of choices made by people operating far from authority, each decision seeming reasonable in the moment. Each step taking them further down a path they never intended to walk. They have adopted an orc. They have committed heresy. And now, they must face the consequences of trying to raise a being designed for war in an environment of peace, attempting to instill human values in a mind shaped by genetics for eternal conflict. The challenges they will face, the transformations their adopted child will undergo, will test everything they think they know about both orcs and humanity. Early life and development. Growing up. Green in a human world. The first few weeks with their new ward are chaotic and challenging in ways the adoptive family did not anticipate. Young orcs, known as youths in orc society, typically emerge from their spores with certain basic instincts and capabilities already in place. They know how to eat, how to fight, how to establish dominance hierarchies with other orcs. What they do not know, what their genetic programming provides no guidance for, is how to exist peacefully among humans. The young orc they have brought into their home operates on instincts designed for an entirely different kind of social structure, and the process of teaching it human norms requires patience, creativity, and a willingness to accept that traditional child-rearing techniques do not translate well to a xenos physiology. The first challenge is simply establishing communication. The orc's mouth structure, designed to accommodate large tusks and pronounce the guttural sounds of the orc language, struggles with Gothic phonemes. Early attempts at teaching it to speak result in approximations that sound more like growls and grunts than words. But the young orc demonstrates an unexpected aptitude for learning. Unlike adult orcs, whose brains are largely devoted to combat instincts and tribal hierarchies, this young one's mind seems more plastic, more capable of forming new neural pathways. Given enough repetition and patience, it begins to understand commands, then simple phrases, and eventually constructs its first halting Gothic sentences. The accent remains thick, the pronunciation never quite human, but communication becomes possible. Naming the orc proves surprisingly contentious within the family. Some advocate for treating it as the xenos it is, refusing to grant it the dignity of a proper human name. Others argue that if they are to raise it as a member of their household, it deserves to be called something other than it, or the orc. They eventually settle on a compromise. They call it Orkson, a name that acknowledges what it is while also following the patronymic traditions of their world. Some family members shorten this to Orky, which the young orc itself seems to prefer, responding to the nickname with what might be interpreted as enthusiasm. The second major challenge is managing the orc's strength. Even as a juvenile, Orky possesses physical power that far exceeds any human child. A playful shove can send a human child sprawling. A display of frustration can damage furniture or punch through walls. The family must teach restraint and control to a being whose natural instincts include no concept of holding back. They develop a system of immediate feedback, letting Orky experience the consequences of its strength in controlled ways. When it accidentally breaks something, they make it repair the damage, teaching both consequence and the value of what it has destroyed. When it hurts someone through carelessness, they ensure it understands the connection between its actions and others' pain. Surprisingly, Orky proves receptive to these lessons. Where adult orcs revel in their physical superiority, delighting in displays of strength, this young orc seems almost distressed when it causes unintended harm. It learns to move carefully in confined spaces, to moderate its grip when handling objects, to measure its interactions with the smaller, fragile of humans around it. This capacity for restraint would be unthinkable in an orc raised among its own kind, where might makes right and any show of weakness invites challenges. But separated from other orcs, lacking the gestalt field that would reinforce dominant submission hierarchies, Orky develops something closer to human self-control. The dietary needs of a growing orc prove easier to manage than expected. Like all orcs, Orky can digest almost anything organic and can derive energy from photosynthesis as well as food consumption. It shows a marked preference for meat, particularly when raw, but can subsist on the same foodstuffs that sustain the human family. They learn that leaving Orky in direct sunlight for several hours daily reduces its need for food, a discovery that proves economically fortunate as feeding a growing orc would otherwise strain their resources significantly. The photosynthetic capacity that makes orcs so dangerous as an invasive species also makes Orky easier to care for than a purely carnivorous creature of similar size would be. As months pass and Orky continues to grow, the family begins to notice ways in which its development differs from what they know of normal orc maturation. In orc society, young orcs grow rapidly when they participate in violence, their bodies responding to combat success with increased size and strength. Orky, denied opportunities for fighting, grows much more slowly. By an age where a wild-born orc would stand 7 or 8 feet tall and be well established in a tribe's hierarchy, Orky remains closer to human dimensions, its growth seeming to follow a pattern more reminiscent of human adolescence than orc development. The family does not fully understand why this is happening, but they are grateful for it, as a fully grown orc would be impossible to house and increasingly difficult to hide from any visitors. What they do not realize is that Orky's stunted growth is directly tied to its separation from other orcs and the Gestalt psychic field. Orc physiology is designed to respond to social context, to grow in the presence of other orcs who can validate dominance and provide psychic resonance. Isolated from its own kind, cut off from the field that would drive its development, Orky's body does not receive the biochemical signals that would trigger rapid growth. It is simultaneously the best and worst thing that could happen to it. Best because it remains physically manageable. Worst because it will never reach its full potential size and strength. Forever remaining something less than what it was designed to be. The family establishes routines and expectations, creating structure for Orky's development. It is given chores appropriate to its strength and capabilities. Hauling water from the well, moving heavy equipment, working in the fields where its strength proves useful. These tasks serve multiple purposes. They keep Orky occupied, teach the value of work, and make its presence economically beneficial to the family. When neighbors or occasional visitors comment on the strange child who seems unusually large and strong, the family offers vague explanations. An orphan they took in, they say. birth defects that account for the unusual appearance, genetic quirks common on some distant world from which the child's parents fled. People on frontier worlds learn not to ask too many questions about each other's pasts, and most accept the explanations at face value, or at least pretend to do so. Social development proves more challenging than physical management. Orky struggles to understand human social cues and emotional responses that come naturally to human children. The concept of personal space confuses it initially, as does the distinction between rough play and actual aggression. It has difficulty understanding deception, approaching all interactions with a directness that is jarring in human social contexts. When it dislikes someone, it says so immediately and bluntly. When it wants something, it asks directly without the subtle negotiation and hinting that characterizes human requests. These traits, while sometimes refreshing in their honesty, create friction with other children and adults who interpret Orky's behavior as rude or aggressive. Yet over time, Orky develops its own unique personality, shaped by both its orc biology and its human upbringing. It displays a particular fascination with how things work, spending hours observing and eventually assisting when the family's equipment needs repair. This resonates with the mech boy instincts encoded in its genes, but channeled toward peaceful purposes rather than weapon construction. It shows unexpected gentleness with animals, particularly younger or injured ones, displaying protective instincts that would be considered weakness in orc society, but which the family encourages as evidence of developing empathy. The question of education looms large. Can an orc learn to read and write? Can it understand mathematics, history, the various subjects that constitute human learning? The family approaches this carefully, unsure what to expect. They begin with basic literacy, using simple texts and direct instruction. The process is slower than with a human child. Orky's brain structure not quite optimized for the abstract symbol manipulation that reading requires. But again, it shows surprising plasticity. Where an adult orc's mind would be too fixed in its patterns to absorb such training, this young orc's consciousness remains malleable enough to form new neural pathways. Eventually, laboriously, Orky learns to read and write in Gothic, though its handwriting remains crude and its spelling phonetic. Mathematics proves more intuitive. Orcs have innate spatial reasoning abilities, necessary for the complex mechanical work that mech boys perform, and these translate reasonably well to numerical manipulation. Orky grasps concepts of quantity, ratio, and basic arithmetic without much difficulty. Higher mathematics remain beyond its reach, but functional numeracy comes easier than literacy, suggesting that certain types of abstract thinking align better with orc cognitive structures than others. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Orky's development is its emerging sense of self-awareness. Human children gradually develop a theory of mind, an understanding that other beings have internal experiences and thoughts separate from their own. Orcs in their natural state possess very little of this, operating more on dominance hierarchies and pack instincts than on sophisticated social cognition. But Orky, raised in a human context and constantly exposed to humans discussing thoughts, feelings, and internal experiences, begins to develop something closer to human self-awareness. It learns to reflect on its own thoughts, to consider others' perspectives, to understand that its experience of the world is not universal, but rather one viewpoint among many. This emerging consciousness, this development of an internal life that would be alien to wild orcs, becomes perhaps the most profound effect of its human upbringing. Orky is not simply an orc trained to behave differently. It is becoming something new, its mind shaped by social context into a form that has never existed before in the galaxy. Whether this transformation represents an improvement, a tragedy, or simply a strange new possibility remains an open question, one that will only grow more complex as Orky continues to mature and must confront what it truly means to be an orc living as a human. Physical transformation, the biology of difference. As Orky progresses through what would be, in human terms, childhood and early adolescence, the physical differences between it and its adoptive family become increasingly pronounced. These are not merely cosmetic distinctions that can be hidden with clever clothing or strategic positioning. They are fundamental biological differences that manifest in everything from basic movement to disease resistance to the simple act of existing in space. Managing these differences, helping Orky navigate a world designed for human proportions and human capabilities, becomes an ongoing challenge that the family must continuously adapt to address. The most obvious physical difference is, of course, Orky's green skin. Unlike the varying shades of brown, tan, and pale that characterize human skin tones, Orky's epidermis maintains a consistent green hue that no amount of scrubbing or sun exposure can alter. This green coloration results from the chlorophyll throughout its tissues, and it actually intensifies slightly in direct sunlight as the photosynthetic process activates. In dim light, the green appears darker, almost grey. In bright sunshine, it takes on an almost luminescent quality that makes Orky stand out dramatically against human skin tones. The family experiments with various methods of concealment. Thick clothing helps, particularly heavy work garments that cover most of the body, but hands, face, and neck remain visible, and attempting to cover these with cosmetics or dyes proves impractical for daily life. They eventually settle on a partial solution. When interactions with outsiders become necessary, they claim Orky suffers from a rare skin condition, a mutation caused by exotic chemicals on whatever distant world they claim to have emigrated from. The excuse is thin, barely plausible, but combined with the frontier world's culture of minding one's own business, it allows Orky to occasionally venture into broader social contexts without immediate exposure. Beyond the skin color, Orky's facial structure presents challenges that only worsen with age. The pronounced tusks that protrude from its lower jaw, a signature feature of all orcs, continue growing throughout its life. By early adolescence, these tusks have become impossible to hide, giving Orky's face a distinctly non-human appearance. The family considers filing them down, but quickly abandons this idea when they discover that the tusks are not just bone, but living tissue, heavily innervated and supplied with blood. Attempting to modify them would cause significant pain and risk dangerous bleeding. The tusks create practical problems beyond mere appearance. They interfere with Orky's speech, making certain phonemes difficult or impossible to pronounce correctly. They catch on clothing and must be carefully navigated when eating. They make wearing any kind of face covering uncomfortable. Most significantly, they identify Orky immediately as inhuman to anyone who sees it clearly, eliminating any possibility of passing as a normal human with unfortunate physical characteristics. The family must accept that Orky's alien nature will be obvious to anyone who looks closely, which severely limits how much they can integrate it into broader human society. Orky's musculature develops along lines that become increasingly divergent from human norms. Where human adolescents gradually add muscle mass through growth and activity, Orky's muscles seem to develop with an efficiency that borders on supernatural. Physical labor produces visible results within weeks rather than months. The muscle tissue itself feels different to the touch, harder, denser, more rigid than human muscle. This density contributes to Orky's extraordinary strength, but it also gives it a bulky, heavily built appearance, even when it is not particularly massive by orc standards. This muscular development creates unexpected challenges. Furniture designed for human weight and proportions begins to fail under Orky's mass. Chairs break, beds collapse, doorways seem designed too narrow, ceilings hang too low. The family must gradually modify their living space to accommodate a being whose physical presence demands more room and stronger construction. They build Orky custom furniture from reinforced materials, widen certain doorways, and eventually construct a separate sleeping area with higher ceilings where it can stand upright without hunching. The strength that comes with this musculature remains both a blessing and a constant source of anxiety. Orky can perform labor that would require multiple adult humans or draft animals. It can lift and carry loads that would be impossible for its human family members. This makes it tremendously useful, particularly on a frontier world where heavy work is constant and labor-saving machines are rare. But the same strength makes every interaction potentially dangerous. A moment of anger or frustration, a sudden movement, a loss of control could result in serious injury or death to a human. The family lives with the constant awareness that their adopted child is, at a fundamental biological level, a weapon that must choose not to harm them. Surprisingly, this situation breeds not fear, but rather deepening trust. Every day that Orky exercises restraint, every moment when it moderates its strength, despite frustration or pain, becomes evidence of its character. The family comes to understand that Orky's gentleness is not weakness, but rather a constant act of self-control. A choice made continuously to be something other than what its biology designed it to be. This realization transforms their relationship, moving from caretakers managing a dangerous creature to genuine family members who recognize and appreciate the effort Orky expends to exist safely in their midst. The dietary aspects of Orky's biology prove easier to manage than its strength, though they still present challenges. Like all orcs, Orky can eat virtually anything organic, its digestive system capable of breaking down materials that would be toxic to humans. The family learns that food waste can simply be given to Orky, who consumes spoiled vegetables, moldy bread, and other refuse without ill effect. This proves economical, reducing waste while ensuring Orky remains well fed. However, they notice that Orky shows distinct preferences, particularly favoring protein sources and showing special enthusiasm for fresh meat, ideally served raw. The photosynthetic capacity provides an unexpected bonus. On particularly sunny days, the family observes that Orky's appetite decreases noticeably. Its skin seems to drink in the light, the green color intensifying as the chlorophyll in its tissues activates. During the long summer months, when daylight extends late into the evening, Orky can subsist on less than half its normal food intake, making feeding it much less burdensome. This discovery leads to a routine where Orky spends several hours each day in direct sunlight, either working outdoors or simply basking, behavior that seems to produce a sense of satisfaction and well-being. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Orky's physiology is its regenerative capacity. Minor injuries that would require days or weeks of healing in a human resolve themselves in Orky within hours or days. Cuts seal themselves with remarkable speed. Bruises fade rapidly. Even significant wounds show healing rates that border on miraculous. The family witnesses this dramatically when Orky suffers a deep laceration while working with sharp tools, a wound that severs skin and muscle and bleeds heavily. They rush to provide first aid, but even as they work, they can see the bleeding slowing, the wound edges beginning to contract. Within a week, only a faint scar remains. This healing capacity makes Orky remarkably difficult to injure seriously through accident, though the family remains cautious. They also notice that Orky never seems to get sick with the various minor illnesses that plague human families: colds, stomach bugs, infections. When asked if it ever feels unwell, Orky struggles to articulate the concept, as if the experience of illness is simply not part of its physiological repertoire. This immunity extends even to parasites and bacterial infections that commonly affect humans in the frontier environment, suggesting that the orc's simplified internal biology and fungal components provide protection against pathogens that evolved to attack human physiology. As Orky matures into late adolescence, the family must confront a disturbing reality. Their adopted child is not following a human developmental trajectory, but rather a different path entirely, one shaped by separation from other orcs. In normal orc development, continuous fighting and social competition drive rapid growth, with successful orcs quickly becoming massive. Orky, denied this violent stimulus, has grown slowly and irregularly, reaching a size larger than any human but substantially smaller than it should be by orc standards. It stands perhaps 7 feet tall, heavily muscled but not enormous, strong beyond human capacity but weak by orc norms. It exists in a physiological middle ground, neither fully human nor properly orcish, its body reflecting the strange hybrid existence it leads. This stunted development worries the family initially, but they gradually come to see it as perhaps the best possible outcome. A full-sized orc would be impossible to accommodate in their home, impossible to clothe or feed adequately, and increasingly difficult to explain. Orcie's intermediate size allows it to function in a human environment while still retaining enough orc physiology to be unmistakably alien. It is a compromise forced by circumstance, but one that makes the impossible situation of an orc living among humans at least marginally sustainable. The physical transformation that Orcie undergoes in these developmental years creates a being that is, in many ways, unique in the galaxy. It is not a normal orc, not remotely. Its size, strength, and capabilities all fall far short of what an orc raised among its own kind would achieve. But it is also not a human, will never be human despite its upbringing and values. It is something new, something unprecedented, a hybrid existence that defies the rigid categories by which the Imperium classifies living things. And as it matures toward adulthood, it must begin grappling with what this physical reality means for its place in the universe. The psychic disconnect, living without the field. To truly understand what makes Orcie's experience unique, we must delve into perhaps the most profound aspect of its difference from other orcs, its complete isolation from the Gestalt psychic field that normally binds greenskin consciousness together. This field, which orcs themselves simply call the battle cry, represents something fundamental to orc existence, a shared psychic space that connects every member of the species to every other member in ways that go far beyond simple communication. For an orc to exist without this connection is akin to a human living without language, without the social bonds that make human consciousness possible. Orcie has never experienced the field, never felt the psychic presence of other orcs, and this absence shapes every aspect of its existence in ways both obvious and subtle. The Gestalt field serves multiple functions in normal orc society, all of which Orcie lacks access to. Most fundamentally, the field creates an instinctive hierarchy among orcs. When two orcs meet, they do not need to test their strength directly to determine who should defer to whom. They can feel, on a psychic level, who is bigger, stronger, more dominant. This feeling bypasses rational thought, operating at a level of pure instinct that makes orc social organizations simple and automatic. The biggest orc leads because every other orc feels compelled to follow, their consciousness literally shaped by the psychic weight of dominance. Orcie possesses no such instinct. When it encounters other beings, there is no automatic sense of where it fits in a hierarchy, no psychic impression of relative strength or dominance. Instead, it must rely on human-style social cognition, reading body language, interpreting tone of voice, making rational judgments about status and authority. This makes its social interactions fundamentally different from how orcs normally operate. Where an orc would instinctively know whether to fight or submit when facing another orc, Orcie must consciously evaluate every social situation, using learned behaviors rather than genetic programming. This absence of hierarchy instinct has profound implications for Orcie's personality and behavior. It does not naturally seek to dominate others or to establish itself as superior. It lacks the constant combativeness that characterizes orc interaction, where every conversation is a potential challenge, and every challenge is an opportunity to prove strength. When human family members give Orcie instructions or corrections, it does not interpret these as challenges to its status, requiring a violent response. It simply processes them as information, as guidance from people it trusts, without the layer of dominant-submission dynamics that would make a normal orc react with aggression to any perceived slight to its position. The second major function of the Gestalt field is its role in Orc technology. There has been much debate among Magos biologists about whether Orc machinery works because of the Gestalt field, or whether it functions through legitimate, if crude, engineering. The truth appears to be somewhere in the middle. Orc technology does follow basic mechanical principles, but it is supplemented and enhanced by the unconscious psychic field that all Orcs generate. A gun that is barely functional by human engineering standards will fire reliably when wielded by an Orc, because the Orc's belief that it should work helps make it work. Red vehicles go faster, not because of paint, but because Orcs believe red vehicles should go faster, and their collective field makes this belief partially manifest in reality. Orcie's isolation from the field means that its relationship with technology follows human rather than Orc patterns. When it learns to repair equipment, it must understand actual mechanical principles rather than relying on the intuitive feel that guides mechboys. Interestingly, this makes Orcie potentially more versatile than a normal Orc mechanic in some ways. It learns to work with properly engineered human technology, understanding circuits and combustion engines and hydraulic systems in ways that make sense to human instructors. It cannot make a pile of scrap miraculously function as a working vehicle through sheer belief, but it can repair a broken atmospheric processor by following the Mechanicus maintenance manual, something most mechboys would find baffling. The family notices this aptitude and encourages it, finding that Orcie has a genuine talent for mechanical work when approached systematically. It can spend hours studying machinery, taking things apart to understand how they function, reassembling them with careful attention to proper procedure. This behavior would be unusual for an Orc mechboy, who operates more on instinct than study, but makes perfect sense for someone with Orcie's hybrid background. The genetic predisposition toward engineering that all Orcs possess has been channeled through human-style systematic learning rather than instinctive tinkering. The third function of the Gestalt field is its role in Orc growth and development. As discussed earlier, Orcs grow in response to combat success and social dominance, their bodies physically expanding when they prove themselves stronger than other Orcs. This growth requires the psychic field to function, as it is the field that translates social success into biological change. Other Orcs, recognizing an individual as big and strong, creates a psychic resonance that triggers growth hormones and structural changes in the Orc's body, creating a feedback loop where success breeds size and size breeds success. Orcie's isolation means this growth mechanism simply does not activate. No matter what it accomplishes, no matter how impressive its achievements by human standards, there are no other Orcs present to recognize and validate its success psychically. Its body never receives the signal to grow larger and stronger. It remains trapped at an intermediate size, larger than human, but smaller than any adult Orc should be. This stunted growth is simultaneously a blessing and a curse. It makes Orcie manageable, allows it to live among humans, prevents it from becoming an unstoppable physical force. But it also means Orcie will never reach its full biological potential, will always be something less than what it could have been, a permanent reminder of its isolation from its own species. Perhaps the most subtle but far-reaching effect of the missing Gestalt field involves consciousness itself. Orcs exist in a state of partial psychic connection to every other member of their species. This connection is not detailed communication, but rather a constant background awareness, a sense of other Orcs present in the psychic landscape. Some scholars theorize that this connection makes individual Orc consciousness somewhat different from human consciousness, that Orcs exist in a space between individual and collective awareness, never fully separate from the group mind, but also not fully subsumed by it. Orcie has never experienced this collective aspect of Orc consciousness. Its mind developed in isolation, shaped entirely by individual experiences and learned behaviors. This makes its consciousness, in some fundamental way, more human than Orcish. It has a fully individual sense of self, an internal experience that is completely separate from any other being. It can reflect on its own thoughts, examine its own motivations, consider hypothetical situations. All mental activities that require the kind of distinct individual consciousness that humans possess, but which may be somewhat muted in orcs who are constantly connected to the Gestalt field. Interestingly, this mental isolation seems to give Orki certain capabilities that would be unusual for an orc. It shows a capacity for long-term planning and delayed gratification that goes beyond typical orc thought patterns. Where orcs tend to live in an eternal present, moving from fight to fight without much consideration for distant futures, Orki can set goals and work toward them over extended periods. It can tolerate boredom and routine, something orcs notoriously struggle with. It can engage in abstract thought and consider philosophical questions about meaning and purpose, mental activities that would be almost impossible for beings whose consciousness is partially occupied by maintaining connection to the Gestalt field. The family gradually recognizes that the absence of the Gestalt field has shaped Orki into something that has never existed before in the galaxy. An orc with fully individual human-style consciousness. This is not merely an orc trained to behave differently, but a being whose fundamental cognitive architecture has developed along human rather than orcish lines. Whether this represents an achievement or a tragedy depends on one's perspective. From a human viewpoint, it might be seen as success, proof that even the most alien consciousness can be shaped by environment into something human-compatible. From an orc perspective, if any orc could understand the situation, it would represent a profound violation, a green skin stripped of everything that makes it truly orcish. For Orki itself, the absence of the field is neither good nor bad, but simply normal. Having never experienced psychic connection to other orcs, it does not miss what it never had. Its consciousness, its sense of self, its way of experiencing the world all seem natural and obvious to it, having no other frame of reference. It does not feel incomplete or isolated from its species because it does not truly understand what it means to be connected. The Gestalt field is an abstract concept to Orki, something it can intellectually understand humans explaining but cannot emotionally grasp, like trying to explain color to someone born blind. Yet there are moments when something seems to call to Orki from deep within its genetic memory, when its alien biology reaches out for a connection that cannot be found. Sometimes it stops mid-task and tilts its head, as if listening for a sound no one else can hear. Sometimes it becomes restless without apparent cause, pacing and agitated until the feeling passes. The family learns to recognize these episodes and give Orki space to work through them, understanding that something in its orc nature is seeking contact with the Gestalt field that does not exist in its vicinity. These moments are rare and brief, but they serve as reminders that no matter how human Orki's upbringing, its biology still reaches for a fundamental aspect of orcish existence that has been denied to it. Psychological development between two worlds. As Orki matures from child to adolescent and then toward adulthood, the psychological implications of its unique situation become increasingly complex and sometimes troubling. It is developing a sophisticated sense of self-awareness, grappling with questions of identity and purpose that would never occur to a normal orc, but which dominate the inner life of any thinking being raised in human society. What emerges is a consciousness caught between two fundamentally incompatible ways of being, shaped by human values and social learning, but housed in biology, designed for purposes that contradict everything it has been taught to believe about how life should be lived. The first major psychological challenge Orki faces is the question of identity itself. Human children gradually develop an understanding of who they are through a complex process that involves internalizing feedback from caregivers, comparing themselves to peers, and constructing a narrative about their place in society. Orky goes through similar processes, but with the added complication that every piece of external feedback emphasizes its difference from those around it. It is not human, can never be human, and this fundamental fact colors every aspect of its developing self-concept. The family tries to navigate this carefully, acknowledging Orky's differences while also treating it as much like a family member as possible. They use language that emphasizes belonging and acceptance while not denying reality. Orky is our child, they say, different but still ours. When Orky begins asking questions about its origins, about why it looks and sounds different from its family, they tell a simplified version of the truth. Orky came from a different place, was born in circumstances beyond anyone's control, and was adopted because the family chose to care for it. They frame the narrative around choice and love rather than accident and expedience, creating a story Orky can build its identity around. But as Orky's intelligence develops and its understanding of the universe expands, the simple story stops being sufficient. Orky begins to grasp what it means to be a Xenos in an Imperium that views all aliens as abominations. It learns about the wars humanity has fought against orc invasions, the millions of humans killed by greenskin violence, the fundamental incompatibility between orcs and human civilization. It reads about orc biology in whatever texts the family can acquire, learning about the Gestalt field, the spore reproduction, the endless warfare that defines orc existence. And gradually, the terrible truth dawns. Orky is not just different from its family. It is a member of a species that exists to destroy everything its family represents. This realization precipitates a profound identity crisis. If orcs are monsters, evil creatures bent on destruction, what does that make Orky? Is it also a monster, only temporarily constrained by environment and circumstance? Are the values it has learned, the empathy and compassion it feels, merely superficial overlays on a nature that is fundamentally violent and destructive? When it restrains its strength, moderates its anger, chooses peaceful resolution over conflict, is it being true to itself or denying its essential nature? These questions consume Orky during what would be, in human terms, late adolescence, a period of intense introspection and psychological turbulence. The family does what it can to help Orky work through these issues, but they are limited by their own uncertainties. They believe that Orky is not defined by its biology, that consciousness and choice matter more than genetic heritage, but they cannot prove this. They can point to Orky's behavior, to its gentleness and self-control, as evidence that it has transcended its orc nature, but they cannot guarantee that deeper instincts will not eventually emerge, that circumstances might not arise where Orky's biology overrides its learning. They offer faith and hope rather than certainty, telling Orky that it gets to choose who it will be, that identity is not predetermined, but rather something each person creates through their actions and decisions. The second major psychological challenge involves Orky's relationship with violence. Orcs are designed for warfare at the most fundamental biological level. Their bodies are optimized for combat, their instincts oriented toward aggression, their entire psychology structured around dominance and conflict. Orky possesses all these biological predispositions, but has been raised with human values that abhor unnecessary violence, that view aggression as a character flaw rather than a virtue, that prize peace and cooperation over conflict and dominance. This creates an internal tension that Orky struggles to manage. It feels impulses toward aggression, desires to test its strength against opposition, instincts that whisper that respect must be earned through violence, and that challenges to its status should be met with force. But it has been taught to suppress these impulses, to view them as wrong, to choose non-violent responses, even when every fiber of its being wants to fight. This is not merely a matter of learning self-control in the way human children must learn to manage their anger. It is a constant battle between biological programming and learned values, between what Orky is and what it wants to be. The family helps Orky find acceptable outlets for its aggressive instincts. They encourage it to take on physically demanding work, to exhaust itself through labor, that requires strength and endurance. They construct a training area where Orki can practice combat movements and techniques in controlled conditions, allowing it to express its fighting instincts without actual violence. They teach it that strength can be used to protect rather than to dominate, that there is nobility in restraining power rather than unleashing it. These strategies help, but they do not eliminate the underlying tension. Orki remains constantly aware of desires that it has been taught to consider wrong, impulses that mark it as fundamentally different from the humans it considers family. Interestingly, Orki develops a somewhat philosophical approach to this internal conflict. It begins to articulate a belief system that acknowledges both its orc nature and its human values, attempting to synthesize the two rather than choosing one over the other. It argues that strength is neutral, neither good nor evil in itself, and that what matters is how strength is used. It embraces the orc value of direct action and decisive force while channeling these through human ethical frameworks about when violence is justified. It becomes, in a sense, a warrior who fights only for cause and protection rather than for its own sake. A being whose capacity for violence is matched by its commitment to use that capacity only in service of ideals it has chosen to uphold. The third psychological challenge involves Orki's emerging sexuality, or more accurately, its lack thereof. Orcs are asexual beings who reproduce through spores, lacking any concept of sexual attraction, romantic love, or the complex of desires and relationships that these create in sexually reproducing species. As a human-raised being, Orki is exposed to human concepts of romance, partnership, and family formation, but these remain abstract ideas with no corresponding internal experience. It watches its human family members navigate relationships, form partnerships, experience attraction, but Orki cannot relate to any of these feelings at a personal level. This creates a particular kind of alienation, where human adolescents begin forming romantic interests and experiencing sexual awakening. Orki moves through this developmental stage completely untouched by such experiences. It understands intellectually that humans find certain other humans attractive, that they form pair bonds and create families, that physical intimacy plays a role in adult relationships. But these remain external observations, behaviors Orki can analyze but not participate in. It is fundamentally alone in ways that go beyond mere social isolation, lacking even the possibility of the intimate connections that humans take for granted as part of adult life. The family recognizes this and struggles with how to address it. They cannot give Orki what it needs most: connection with others of its own kind who might understand its experience. They can only acknowledge the reality of its isolation and help it find meaning in forms of relationship that are available to it. Orki develops deep platonic bonds with family members, friendships built on shared experiences and mutual trust rather than romantic or sexual attraction. It finds satisfaction in these connections, even as it recognizes they cannot fulfill needs it does not quite have, but suspects normal beings do. Perhaps the most profound psychological aspect of Orki's development is its capacity for moral reasoning and ethical reflection. Normal orcs operate on simple principles: might makes right, fighting is good, winners deserve respect, and losers deserve nothing. These are not moral principles in the human sense, but rather descriptions of natural order, accepted truths that require no justification. Orki, raised with human values, develops something much more complex: an actual ethical framework that allows it to evaluate actions as right or wrong, to consider principles like fairness and justice, to feel guilt when it fails to live up to its own standards. This capacity for moral reasoning creates yet another point of divergence between Orki and normal orcs. When Orki causes harm accidentally, it feels genuine remorse, a concern for the victim's suffering that has nothing to do with consequences for itself. When it witnesses injustice, it experiences anger not because it is personally threatened, but because abstract principles are being violated. When it must choose between self-interest and doing what it believes to be right, it can prioritize ethics over advantage in ways that would be incomprehensible to an orc whose moral framework begins and ends with personal dominance. The family recognizes this capacity for moral reasoning as perhaps the strongest evidence that Orky has truly become something more than its biology would suggest possible. An orc that feels guilt, that prioritizes justice, that restrains its own strength in service of ethical principles. This is not merely a trained animal, but a genuine moral agent. A being who makes real choices about how to act rather than simply following instincts. They cannot know whether this would persist in the face of serious challenges, whether Orky's moral reasoning would survive if it were exposed to other orcs, or if circumstances forced it to choose between its values and its survival. But in the protected environment they have created, Orky demonstrates a capacity for ethical behavior that deserves to be recognized and respected. As Orky approaches full physical maturity, its psychological state remains complex and sometimes contradictory. It has developed human-style individual consciousness while carrying biological imperatives designed for a completely different kind of existence. It possesses sophisticated moral reasoning housed in a body optimized for violence. It feels genuine love and loyalty toward beings who are fundamentally alien to its genetic nature. It struggles constantly with internal conflicts between what it is and what it wants to be, between biological programming and learned values, between the easy path of giving into instinct and the harder path of choosing to be something other than what nature intended. The result is a being of remarkable psychological complexity, perhaps more complex than either a normal human or a normal orc, precisely because it must navigate between two incompatible modes of existence. Orky cannot simply be, cannot relax into instinctive behavior or unchallenged assumptions about how life works. It must constantly choose, constantly evaluate, constantly construct its identity through conscious effort rather than inheriting a ready-made selfhood from biology or culture. This makes existence difficult, sometimes painful, but it also makes Orky something unique in the galaxy, an orc with genuine interiority, with a rich inner life that approaches the complexity of human consciousness while remaining shaped by the alien biology that defines its physical being. Social integration, challenges, navigating human society. As Orky grows older and the family's isolation becomes less sustainable, the practical challenges of integrating an orc into human society become increasingly difficult to navigate. The frontier world they inhabit is remote and sparsely populated, which has allowed them to keep Orky's true nature largely hidden from broader scrutiny, but total isolation is impossible. Trade caravans pass through occasionally. Neighboring homesteaders sometimes visit or require assistance. Officials from the administratum appear every few years to conduct censuses and collect tithes. Each interaction with the outside world requires careful planning and presents risks of exposure that grow more serious as Orky becomes larger and its alien nature more obvious. The family develops elaborate strategies for managing these interactions. When visitors are expected, Orky is typically kept out of sight, working in distant fields or staying in a separate structure far from the main house. If questioned about the additional structure or unusual amounts of food consumption, the family claims they have hired laborers or taken in distant relatives. When unexpected visits occur and Orky is present, the family positions it carefully, using lighting and distance to minimize how clearly its features can be seen. They have prepared explanations for its appearance: a genetic disorder, birth defects from exposure to toxic materials, mutations common on certain worlds, stories that are barely plausible, but benefit from the frontier culture's reluctance to pry into personal matters. Orky itself is trained extensively in how to interact with outsiders when hiding is not an option. It is taught to keep conversations brief, to avoid direct eye contact that might reveal the alien nature of its gaze, to position itself so that tusks are less visible, and green skin can be attributed to shadow or poor lighting. It learns to speak in short, gruff phrases that outsiders might interpret as taciturnity rather than difficulty with human speech. Most importantly, it is taught to defer to its human family members in all social interactions, to never challenge or contradict them in front of others, to present as a subordinate who follows instructions rather than an independent agent who might be evaluated on its own terms. These precautions work reasonably well for years, but they cannot prevent all close calls. The most dangerous incident occurs when a tech priest from a nearby Mechanicus outpost visits to examine the family's agricultural equipment for compliance with ancient patterns. The tech priest's augmented sensors pick up unusual readings from the separate structure where Orki lives, biological signatures that do not match any known human variants, electromagnetic emissions consistent with Xenos physiology, thermal patterns that suggest something in the structure is photosynthesizing. The tech priest begins asking pointed questions about who else lives on the property, what exactly is in the outlying building, whether the family has encountered any unusual organisms in the area. The situation is diffused only through quick thinking and calculated risk. The family claims the unusual readings come from experimental fungal cultures they are growing for food production, a technically accurate statement that misrepresents Orki as a crop rather than a person. They offer to show the tech priest the cultures, gambling that the Mechanicus adept will decline to personally investigate something so mundane and biological. The gamble pays off. The tech priest, whose augmented body makes him uncomfortable in environments full of organic life, accepts the explanation and departs after extracting promises that any technological improvements to the cultivation process will be reported for approval. But the incident leaves the family shaken, aware that they came within a hair's breadth of discovery and the violent consequences that would follow. As Orki approaches what humans would consider adulthood, the question of broader social integration becomes unavoidable. Can Orki have any kind of normal social existence? Can it form relationships with beings beyond the immediate family? Can it find meaning and purpose that goes beyond simply hiding in the wilderness pretending not to exist? The family recognizes that complete isolation is psychologically damaging, that Orki needs social contact beyond the small circle of humans who have raised it. But they also understand the risks of exposure, both to Orki and to themselves. Any human who learns the truth becomes either an ally who must be trusted completely or a threat who knows enough to destroy them all. They begin carefully expanding Orki's social circle, starting with the most isolated and least dangerous contacts. There are a few neighboring homesteaders who live so remotely that they see other humans rarely and value practical help over asking uncomfortable questions. The family allows Orki to assist these neighbors with heavy labor, establishing it as a helper who can be counted on for difficult tasks. Orki's formidable strength makes it valuable in frontier contexts where moving massive equipment or clearing land requires muscle that draft animals cannot provide. These interactions teach Orki important lessons about navigating human social dynamics. It learns that humans respond well to practical help and simple kindness, but become suspicious when questioned too directly about its nature. It discovers that many frontier folk care less about what someone is and more about whether they can be trusted to honor their word and contribute to the community. It finds that self-deprecating humor about its appearance can deflect questions that might otherwise become dangerous. When someone comments on its unusual looks, Orki learns to laugh and make jokes about being the ugliest person on the planet, deflecting curiosity with humor rather than defensiveness. Slowly, cautiously, Orki develops a reputation in the small, scattered community as a reliable helper. Strong but gentle, strange-looking but harmless. People begin to accept its presence, to request its assistance with tasks requiring unusual strength, to include it marginally in the informal network of mutual aid that makes frontier survival possible. It remains an outsider, never fully accepted or invited into homes, always viewed with some suspicion and unease. but tolerated and even appreciated for its practical usefulness. This is far from full social integration, but it represents a kind of provisional acceptance that allows Orki to exist in human society, rather than being completely isolated from it. However, this provisional acceptance depends entirely on Orki remaining useful and unthreatening. Any display of aggression, any moment of violence, even in self-defense, would shatter the fragile tolerance it has cultivated. The community accepts Orki because it appears harmless despite its size and strength, because it consistently demonstrates restraint and gentleness. If circumstances arose that forced Orki to defend itself or others with violence, if humans witnessed the combat capabilities that lurk beneath its careful self-control, the response would be immediate and extreme. Fear would replace tolerance, and fear in the Imperium leads inevitably to purging. The psychological toll of maintaining this performance, of constantly presenting a carefully curated version of itself while hiding its true nature and capabilities, weighs heavily on Orki. It experiences what might be called code switching to an extreme degree, shifting not just between behavioral modes, but between fundamental aspects of identity depending on social context. Around family, Orki can relax somewhat, can discuss its thoughts and feelings more openly, can acknowledge the tensions between its biology and values. Around outsiders, Orki must become a simpler being, projecting only the non-threatening aspects while suppressing anything that might reveal its complexity or challenge human assumptions about what a Xenos can be. This constant performance creates a deep sense of isolation despite surface-level social contact. Orki is surrounded by humans, but can never truly be known by most of them. The real Orki, the being with complex thoughts, moral reasoning, psychological depth, must remain hidden behind a facade of simple usefulness. Only the immediate family sees and accepts the full reality of who Orki is, and even they cannot fully understand the alien aspects of its experience. Orki is accepted but not truly known, tolerated but not embraced, included but never allowed to simply be itself, without calculation and concealment. The question of deeper relationships becomes particularly fraught. Could Orki develop genuine friendships with humans outside the family? The challenges are immense. True friendship requires honesty and vulnerability, the ability to share one's real self rather than a performed version. But Orki cannot reveal its true self to most humans without risking both its own destruction and bringing catastrophe down on the family that has sheltered it. Any friendship must be built on partial truths and careful concealment, limiting the depth of connection that is possible. Nevertheless, Orki does form something resembling friendships with a few individuals in the scattered community. There is an elderly homesteader named Joram who treats Orki with gruff kindness and seems to ask fewer questions than most. There is a young woman named Kara who works as a wilderness guide and appears fascinated rather than repelled by Orki's differences. These relationships remain cautious and somewhat superficial, but they provide Orki with social connection beyond the family, with evidence that it can be accepted, however provisionally, by humans who are not bound by familial obligation to tolerate its presence. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Orki's social integration challenges is its exclusion from collective human activities that build community bonds. It cannot participate in the frontier world's occasional festivals or communal celebrations where its presence would draw too much attention. It cannot visit the small settlement that serves as a trading hub where multiple strangers would see it and questions would become unavoidable. It cannot join in the drinking and storytelling that frontier folk engage in during long winter nights when survival depends on maintaining social bonds. It remains always on the periphery, close enough to human society to feel the pull of belonging, but kept at sufficient distance that full inclusion remains impossible. The family watches this isolation and wishes they could do more to help, but they understand the constraints they all operate under. Orki's integration into human society can only go so far before the lies and concealment become unsustainable. They have created a space where Orki can exist with some dignity, with some measure of social contact and purpose. But they cannot give it the full acceptance and belonging that every conscious being craves. It is a compromise forced by circumstances, making the best of an impossible situation without ever achieving anything resembling normalcy or full inclusion. As Orky matures, it comes to accept these limitations, understanding that its social existence will always be constrained by the fundamental fact of its alien nature. It finds meaning in the relationships it does have, valuing quality of connection over quantity, appreciating the few humans who accept it despite its obvious differences. It learns to find satisfaction in being useful rather than seeking to be celebrated, in quiet inclusion rather than demanding full equality. These adaptations are psychologically necessary, but they come at a cost. Orky carries a deep loneliness, an awareness that it will never fully belong anywhere, that it exists in a liminal space between species with no possibility of finding others who truly understand its unique position in the universe. The call of violence, managing innate aggression. Despite years of human socialization and the development of sophisticated moral reasoning, Orky can never fully escape the biological imperatives encoded in its genes. The drive toward violence that characterizes all orcs remains present, a constant pressure beneath the surface of its carefully maintained self-control. Managing this aggression, finding acceptable outlets for instincts that cannot be completely suppressed, becomes one of the defining challenges of Orky's adult life and reveals the limits of nurture's ability to overcome nature. The violence impulse in orcs is not quite the same as human aggression, though outsiders often conflate the two. Human anger typically arises from specific triggers, threats, frustrations, perceived injustices. Orc aggression is more fundamental, less reactive, and more proactive. It is not anger in the human sense, but rather a positive drive toward conflict itself, an urge to test strength and prove dominance that exists independent of provocation. An orc does not need to be angry to want to fight. Fighting is simply what orcs do, the primary means by which they interact with the world and establish their place in it. Orky experiences this drive as a constant background presence, sometimes quiet and manageable, sometimes nearly overwhelming. It manifests as physical restlessness, as difficulty concentrating on peaceful activities, as intrusive thoughts about fighting and violence that Orky must consciously push aside. When it sees something that could be challenged or tested, when it encounters beings that could be fought, instinct whispers, suggestions about dominance displays and physical contests. These are not conscious desires in the sense of Orky choosing to think about violence. They are more like reflexes of the mind, automatic responses that Orky has learned to intercept before they manifest in behavior. The family recognizes early on that Orky needs outlets for this aggression that do not involve harming others. They establish routines and activities that channel the drive toward violence into physically demanding but non-destructive expressions. Heavy labor proves particularly effective. Hours of lifting, carrying, building, clearing land exhaust Orky's body while giving it the sense of physical struggle that partly satisfies its instincts. The work serves double duty, providing practical value to the family while also functioning as aggression management for Orky. They also create a training area where Orky can practice combat movements without actual opponents. Orky learns to treat training as a kind of meditation, working through fighting techniques with focused intensity, perfecting strikes and blocks against imaginary enemies. This practice allows it to physically express the combat instincts while maintaining complete control over when and how violence manifests. The training becomes almost ritualistic, a daily activity that Orky depends on for psychological equilibrium, using controlled violence to manage the urge toward uncontrolled violence. But physical outlets can only do so much. The violence drive is not merely about physical exertion, but about actual conflict, testing oneself against opposition, establishing dominance through victory. Training and labor satisfy the body's need for physical expression, but do not fully address the psychological need for actual confrontation. Orky experiences this gap as a kind of hunger that cannot be fully fed, a desire for something that its moral principles tell it is wrong to pursue. The challenge intensifies when Orky encounters situations where violence would be the natural orc response. When insulted by humans who mock its appearance, instinct screams for Orky to assert dominance, to physically demonstrate that respect is owed rather than optional. When it witnesses stronger humans intimidating weaker ones, the orc part of its psychology wants to intervene not out of justice, but out of a desire to establish itself as the most dominant presence, to fight the strong and claim their status through victory. When it faces actual threats to itself or others, the combat instincts become almost overwhelming, offering clear and simple solutions that Orky must resist in favor of more complex ethical responses. The family helps Orky develop cognitive techniques for managing these impulses. They teach it to pause when feeling aggressive, to mentally step back and evaluate whether violence is actually justified in the situation, or whether it is simply instinct-seeking expression. They help it articulate the difference between protective violence undertaken in defense of others and dominance, violence undertaken to establish hierarchy. They emphasize that Orky's strength makes it responsible for restraint, that greater capability requires greater care in how that capability is employed. These techniques work reasonably well in normal circumstances, but certain situations prove especially challenging. Competition, even friendly competition, triggers Orky's dominance instincts in ways that require constant vigilance to manage. When helping neighbors with work that involves multiple people, if someone suggests comparing who can lift more or work faster, Orky must consciously suppress the drive to dominate the competition utterly. It has learned to intentionally hold back, to lose sometimes by choice, understanding that always winning through overwhelming physical advantage would isolate it and potentially reveal capacities it should keep hidden. The most difficult moments come when Orky witnesses actual injustice or cruelty. Its moral reasoning tells it that intervention is right, that power should be used to protect the vulnerable and resist oppression. But the form that intervention takes requires careful thought. An orc would simply beat the aggressor into submission, establishing dominance through physical superiority. Orky must find alternatives: diplomacy, social pressure, involving authorities, using its size to intimidate without actually fighting. Sometimes these alternatives work. Sometimes they do not. An Orky must watch bad things happen while it restrains itself, knowing that the violence it could employ to stop the situation would create worse problems than it solves. There comes an incident that tests Orky's commitment to non-violence more severely than anything previous. A group of traveling merchants attempts to rob an elderly neighbor, threatening violence if cooperation is not forthcoming. Orky happens to be nearby, working in the fields, and hears the commotion. Every instinct screams for immediate violent intervention. These are threats to someone under Orky's protection, challenges to its territory, opportunities to fight with moral justification. Orky approaches the situation, positioning its massive form between the merchants and the elderly homesteader, making no threats, but simply standing as an obvious obstacle. The merchants initially attempt to intimidate this large figure, but they quickly realize that threats will not work against something of Orky's size, and the situation balances on a knife edge. If the merchants attack, Orky will have to respond, and response will likely mean revealing capabilities it has kept hidden. If Orky speaks, its voice and manner of speech will mark it clearly as non-human to these strangers. The solution comes from the elderly homesteader, who steps forward and claims that Orky is their hired protector, implying that violence against the merchants has been paid for and will be delivered unless they leave immediately. The merchants evaluate the odds, recognize they are not favorable, and retreat. Violence is avoided, but Orky's protective capabilities are now slightly more visible to the community. This incident reinforces several truths that Orky has been learning. First, that its size and strength can be used to deter violence without necessarily employing violence. That implied threat can sometimes be as effective as actual force. Second, that the instinct toward violence can be channeled through moral purpose, that protecting others provides a framework for controlled aggression that serves positive ends. Third, that any use of its physical capabilities, even in defense, increases visibility and risk, requiring careful judgment about when intervention is worth potential exposure. The incident also reveals something about how the local community views Orky. In the aftermath, several neighbors approached the family to express appreciation for Orky's intervention, acknowledging that they have all relied on its help at various times and are glad to have such a protector in the area. This is the first time humans outside the immediate family have explicitly acknowledged Orky's role as more than simply a useful laborer. It represents a subtle shift in status, a recognition that Orky serves a valuable function beyond mere physical work, that it provides security through its presence and restraint. But along with this recognition comes increased scrutiny and risk. Having demonstrated protective capabilities, Orky may be called upon to use them again. Other situations may arise where intervention is expected, where refusal to help would be noticed and questioned. Each such incident brings risk of exposure, of having to employ violence in ways that reveal Orky's true nature to those who currently accept only partial truths about what it is. The family understands this dynamic and worries about where it leads. As Orky moves through early adulthood, it develops an increasingly sophisticated relationship with its own violent instincts. It accepts that the drive toward aggression is part of who it is, not something that can be eliminated, but rather something that must be managed and channeled. It recognizes situations where protective violence is genuinely justified, and develops protocols for employing minimal necessary force in those circumstances. It creates mental frameworks for evaluating threats and responses, bringing rational analysis to situations where instinct would simply lash out. Most importantly, it maintains awareness of the costs of violence, not just in terms of potential harm to others, but in terms of what violence would mean for its own self-concept and psychological well-being. The result is a being who possesses formidable combat capabilities, but employs them only rarely and with great reluctance, who experiences constant pressure toward violence, but consistently chooses restraint, who carries the potential for tremendous destructive force while maintaining almost perfect control over when and how that force is expressed. This represents perhaps the greatest achievement of Orky's human upbringing, not the elimination of Ork aggression, which would be impossible, but rather the subordination of that aggression to moral reasoning and conscious choice, turning a being designed as a weapon into a guardian who uses strength only in service of protection rather than domination. Finding purpose, a life's work in a human world. As Orky matures into full adulthood, the question of purpose becomes increasingly pressing. Human beings find meaning through various sources: family, work, spiritual practice, service to community, pursuit of personal excellence. Orcs find meaning through fighting, through establishing dominance, through the simple satisfaction of being the biggest and strongest. Orky, caught between these two frameworks, must construct purpose from elements of both, building a meaningful existence that honors its biological nature while remaining consistent with the human values it has internalized. The most obvious path to purpose is work. Orky's extraordinary physical capabilities make it valuable in contexts requiring strength and endurance beyond human capacity. But the family recognizes that meaningful work is more than just useful labor. It should provide not just employment, but also a sense of mastery, development of skills, contribution to something larger than oneself. They encourage Orky to think beyond simple physical labor toward work that engages its capabilities more fully. The breakthrough comes when Orky begins seriously pursuing mechanical work, drawing on the innate mech boy tendencies that all orcs possess, while channeling these through formal learning and systematic practice. The frontier world has constant need for equipment repair, machinery maintenance, and improvised solutions to technical problems. Skilled mechanics are rare and valuable. Orki's combination of genetic predisposition toward engineering, human-taught systematic approach to problem-solving, and extraordinary physical strength for handling heavy equipment creates a unique skill set that few others possess. Orki begins taking on repair work, first for the immediate family and neighbors, then gradually building a reputation as a mechanic who can handle jobs others find impossible. Its ability to manually manipulate components that would require specialized equipment for human mechanics, combined with genuine understanding of mechanical principles, makes it highly effective. The work provides several benefits. Economic value that makes Orki's presence advantageous rather than merely tolerated, intellectual engagement that challenges its mind as well as its body, and growing expertise that builds confidence and sense of mastery. But work alone cannot fully satisfy the deeper question of purpose that Orki grapples with. What is the point of its existence? What meaning can be found in being an orc living among humans, forever an outsider, unable to be fully either what it was designed to be or what it wishes to become? These questions drive Orki to deeper philosophical reflection, to examining the very nature of meaning and value in the Imperium's harsh universe. The family provides spiritual guidance as best they can, sharing the folk religious beliefs common on frontier worlds. These tend to be simplified versions of the imperial cult, focusing on the emperor as protector and provider, rather than the more complex theological structures maintained by the ecclesiarchy. Orki participates in family prayers and observances, finds some comfort in the rituals, even if the doctrinal content does not fully speak to its alien consciousness. The idea of a divine figure who values all his subjects and requires loyalty and service resonates with Orki's desire to find meaning through dedication to something greater than itself. But institutional religion presents obvious problems for a Xenos in an Imperium, where the imperial creed explicitly denies that aliens have souls or value. The very prayers Orki learns with its family include references to purging the alien, to humanity's divine right to rule the stars, to the abomination of Xenos existence. Orki must somehow reconcile participating in a faith that, if applied consistently, would demand its own destruction. The family helps by emphasizing that the Emperor values service and loyalty over breeding, that dedication matters more than genetics, constructing a personalized theology that allows Orki to participate without accepting the full implications of imperial doctrine. Through this engagement with spirituality, Orki begins developing its own philosophy of purpose. It articulates a belief that meaning comes not from what one is, but from what one chooses to do with what one has been given. Orki did not choose to be an orc. It did not choose to be separated from its kind and raised among aliens. These are simply facts of its existence, neither good nor bad in themselves. What matters is how it responds to these circumstances, what it makes of the situation it finds itself in. If it can use its strength to help rather than harm, if it can employ its capabilities in service of others rather than in pursuit of dominance, if it can be a force for protection rather than destruction, then its existence has value regardless of its biological origins. This philosophy allows Orki to find purpose in being useful, in being someone its community can depend on for help with difficult tasks, for protection from threats, for solutions to problems requiring unusual strength or skill. It begins to see itself not as a monster temporarily restrained, but as a guardian deliberately employed, a role that gives meaning to the very capabilities that might otherwise mark it as dangerous. The potential for violence becomes meaningful through the choice to restrain it. The alien biology becomes valuable through the decision to employ it for others' benefit rather than its own dominance. Orki also finds purpose in the simple fact of its unique position. It is, so far as anyone knows, the only orc raised by humans, the only greenskin attempting to live according to human values. This uniqueness could be viewed as merely strange or unfortunate, Orki chooses to view it as an opportunity. Perhaps its existence proves something important about the malleability of consciousness, about the power of environment to shape beings beyond their apparent genetic constraints. If an orc can be taught to value peace, to exercise restraint, to develop moral reasoning, then perhaps the rigid categories by which the Imperium classifies living things are less absolute than doctrine claims. This realization leads Orki to a deeper sense of purpose, being evidence that choice matters, that individuals are not simply expressions of their genetic heritage, that consciousness itself has power to transcend biological constraints. Orki sees its own life as potentially meaningful, not just in what it does, but in what it represents. Proof that even a being designed as a weapon can choose to be something else, that nature does not have to be destiny, that nurture can overcome breeding given sufficient effort and commitment. The family supports this developing sense of purpose, though they remain pragmatic about its limitations. They remind Orki that its existence must remain secret, that the evidence it represents cannot be widely shared without catastrophic consequences. They caution against developing too grand a sense of mission or significance, emphasizing that safety and survival must take precedence over any impulse to prove philosophical points. But they also acknowledge that Orki needs this larger framework of meaning. That simple utility is not enough to sustain a sophisticated consciousness through a life of permanent outsider status. As years pass and Orki settles into adulthood, its life develops a pattern that provides stability, if not normalcy. Most days are occupied with work, maintaining the family's equipment, taking on repair jobs for neighbors, performing heavy labor that humans cannot manage. Evenings are spent with family, participating in meals and conversation, the comfortable routines of domestic life. Regular training sessions allow controlled expression of combat instincts. Occasional incidents requiring protective intervention provide opportunities to employ its capabilities in morally justified ways. It is not the life Orki would have lived if born among its own kind. It will never experience the surge of the Gestalt field, the brotherhood of violence that binds orc mobs together, the simple satisfaction of rising through ranks by proving itself strongest. It will never lead a tribe of its own, never shout battle cries while charging into honorable combat, never experience what it truly means to be orcish in the fullest sense. These possibilities have been foreclosed by circumstances beyond its control, replaced with something quieter but perhaps more complex, a life of service, restraint, and purposeful choosing to be other than what biology intended. Whether this represents a good life or merely a survivable one remains debatable. Orki has moments of contentment, times when its existence feels meaningful, and its choices validated by their positive consequences. It also has moments of profound alienation, when the gap between what it is and where it exists seems impossibly wide, when the effort of being constantly different becomes exhausting. These moments pass, as all moments do, and Orki continues, finding what purpose it can in a universe that never intended a being like it to exist, that it finds purpose at all, that it constructs meaning rather than drowning in meaninglessness, represents a kind of triumph. Small perhaps, and invisible to most, but real nonetheless. Reflection and implications. What this means. The story of Orki, this impossible being, this orc raised by humans, forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and the categories by which the Imperium orders its universe. What does Orki's existence tell us about both orcs and humans? What implications does this scenario carry for our understanding of biology versus environment in shaping what a being can become? And what does it mean for the Imperium's xenophobic doctrines if even the most alien consciousness can be shaped by nurture into something approaching humanity? First, we must consider what Orki's development reveals about orc biology and psychology. The standard imperial understanding holds that orcs are unchangeable weapons, genetic programs that can only express themselves in violence and destruction. The mech boys build weapons, the pain boys patch up wounded warriors, and the regular boys exist to fight. This is simply what orcs are, determined by their genes and incapable of being anything else. Orc's existence challenges this assumption profoundly. Here is an orc that learned to read and write, that develops sophisticated moral reasoning, that exercises restraint and chooses cooperation over conflict. These capabilities would be impossible if orc consciousness were as rigidly determined by biology as imperial dogma claims. Yet we must be careful not to overstate the case. Orc is not simply an orc that learned different behaviors. Its entire developmental trajectory has been fundamentally altered by environmental factors that normal orcs never experience. Separation from the Gestalt field, isolation from other orcs during critical development periods, constant exposure to human social structures and values. All these factors have shaped Orc's consciousness in ways that might not be replicable under different circumstances. An adult orc, captured and subjected to human socialization, would likely remain fundamentally orcish in psychology. Orc's malleability may be a feature of developmental timing rather than evidence that orc consciousness is generally plastic. The question of the Gestalt field's role remains crucial. Normal orcs exist in a state of partial connection to every other member of their species through this psychic phenomenon. Orc has never experienced this connection, developing individual, human-style consciousness instead. This raises the possibility that much of what we consider essential to orc psychology may actually be a product of the Gestalt field, rather than orc biology per se. If orcs could somehow be separated from the field during development, perhaps many more could develop along lines similar to Orc. Or perhaps Orc is unique in some genetic quirk that made this development possible. We cannot know without more examples, and more examples are unlikely to ever exist, given the circumstances required to create them. From a human perspective, Orc's existence raises equally troubling questions. The Imperium's entire xenophobic ideology rests on the assumption that aliens are fundamentally and unchangeably other, that no common ground exists between humanity and xenos species, that coexistence is impossible and extermination necessary. Orc demonstrates that at least one xenos species can develop in ways that approximate human consciousness and values when given appropriate environment. If this is true for orcs, what about other species? Could Eldari, Tau, or other intelligent aliens be shaped by environment to be less alien, more compatible with human civilization? The Imperium cannot afford to seriously entertain such questions. The entire structure of imperial society depends on maintaining clear boundaries between humanity and xenos, between loyal subjects and abominations to be purged. Admitting that aliens might be educable, that they might develop moral reasoning comparable to humans, that they might be capable of peaceful coexistence. These admissions would undermine the theological and political foundations on which the Imperium is built. Better to maintain that xenos are irredeemable monsters, that any apparent cooperation or compatibility is merely deception, that humanity must stand alone against a hostile galaxy. Yet the frontier family that raised Orc has direct experience contradicting these doctrines. They have seen, day after day for years, that an orc can be gentle, trustworthy, and genuinely caring about others' welfare. They have watched Orc develop from a frightened child into a capable adult who exercises remarkable self-control and makes genuine ethical choices. They cannot simply dismiss this experience, cannot unknow what they have learned about the flexibility of consciousness and the power of environment to shape development. For them at least, the absolute xenophobia of imperial doctrine has been revealed as perhaps too simplistic, based on overgeneralization from the typical to the universal. This creates a tension between personal experience and societal doctrine that has no easy resolution. The family cannot openly challenge imperial ideology without inviting their own destruction. They cannot share their knowledge without exposing Orc and themselves to the Inquisition's purifying violence. but they also cannot unsee what they have seen, cannot return to the simple certainties of regarding all xenos as monsters deserving only extermination. They must live with the cognitive dissonance between what they have been taught to believe and what they know to be true from direct experience, a dissonance that perhaps exists for more imperial citizens than official doctrine would suggest. The question of whether Orki's existence represents success or tragedy also warrants careful consideration. From one perspective, it is clearly a success. A being designed as a weapon has been shaped into a productive member of society who contributes positively to its community. The violent potential that should make Orki dangerous has been channeled into protective capabilities used only when genuinely justified. A consciousness that should be simple and brutal has developed sophistication and nuance. These are achievements worth recognizing and celebrating. From another perspective, Orki's existence represents a profound tragedy. It has been cut off from its own species, denied the only form of existence its biology was designed to experience. It will never reach full orc size or strength, will never feel the surge of the Gestalt field, will never participate in the fundamental aspects of orcish life that might have given its existence a different kind of meaning. It must live forever as an outsider, neither fully human nor properly orc, accepted nowhere completely, and understood by almost no one. Its entire life is a performance of restraint, constant effort, expended to be something other than what nature intended. This is not liberation, but rather a different form of constraint, arguably more burdensome than the simple directness of natural orc existence. Which perspective is correct likely depends on what one values most: individual moral agency and peaceful coexistence, or authenticity and living according to one's nature. These are not questions with obvious answers, and reasonable beings might disagree about whether Orki's life represents triumph over nature or nature betrayed by nurture. Perhaps both perspectives hold partial truth, and Orki's existence is simultaneously successful and tragic, achievement and loss, evidence of consciousness's flexibility and illustration of its limits. The broader implications for the Imperium are profound if one pauses to consider them seriously. If consciousness can be shaped by environment to the degree that Orki demonstrates, then the entire project of genetic purity that obsesses imperial society may be misguided. Perhaps what makes someone fit for service to the Emperor is not their genetic heritage, but rather their values and choices. Perhaps mutants, abhumans, and even properly socialized xenos could serve the Imperium as effectively as genetically pure humans. Perhaps the rigid biological categories that determine one's place in society are less meaningful than doctrine suggests. Such thinking is, of course, extremely dangerous from the Imperium's perspective. Opening the door to questioning genetic determinism leads to questioning the entire social hierarchy built on breeding and bloodlines. If a Xenos can be taught to value the Emperor's peace, why not accept them into the Imperium? If consciousness is shaped by environment rather than genes, why do Space Marine chapters so carefully track genetic purity? Why do noble houses obsess over pure bloodlines? Why does the Imperium exterminate mutants rather than educating them? These questions undermine too many foundational assumptions to be safely asked in any official context. Yet the questions persist, embodied in every Orki-like existence that challenges the categories by which society operates. The Imperium maintains its doctrines through violence and censorship, crushing exceptions and suppressing evidence that contradicts official narratives. But individual humans who encounter exceptions like Orki cannot unhave those experiences. The knowledge spreads, quietly and carefully, in whispered conversations and private doubts, creating a substrate of uncertainty beneath the confident surface of imperial ideology. Perhaps most profoundly, Orki's existence raises questions about the nature of the soul that the imperial creed claims to answer definitively. According to imperial theology, Xenos have no souls, are empty vessels worthy only of destruction, fundamentally different from humans who possess immortal essence created by and returning to the Emperor. But if Orky demonstrates consciousness, moral reasoning, capacity for love and loyalty and self-sacrifice, what exactly distinguishes it from a being with a soul? If the answer is simply genetic heritage, then the concept of soul becomes trivial, reduced to nothing more than species classification. If the answer is something about consciousness or moral capacity, then Orky might possess whatever quality souls are supposed to represent. The ecclesiarchy would argue that Orky's apparent consciousness is deception, that Xenos can mimic human qualities without truly possessing them, that any seeming virtue in aliens is either illusion or trap meant to lower humanity's guard. But this argument becomes increasingly difficult to sustain when confronted with direct experience of a being who chooses restraint over violence day after day, who exercises genuine moral reasoning, who demonstrates qualities that match or exceed those of many humans. At some point, the distinction between genuine consciousness and perfect simulation of consciousness becomes meaningless. If something acts indistinguishably from a conscious being across all possible tests, declaring it unconscious based purely on its genetics begins to seem arbitrary. These are not comfortable questions, and the Imperium is structured specifically to prevent them from being seriously asked. But Orky's existence makes them unavoidable for everyone who truly knows what it is and what it has become. The family, the few neighbors who have puzzled out the truth or guessed enough to understand, the rare visitors who see past the explanations to recognize something profoundly unusual. All these people carry knowledge that challenges imperial certainties, experiences that reveal the inadequacy of simple categories, doubts that can be suppressed but never completely eliminated. Conclusion. We have explored what might be the most improbable scenario in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. An orc raised by humans, shaped by environment and choice, into something that transcends its biological origins. This journey has taken us from the fundamental biology of the orc species through the psychological development of an individual consciousness emerging between two incompatible ways of being, to the social challenges of existing as permanent outsider, to the philosophical questions this existence raises about nature, nurture, and the construction of identity. Orky represents something unique in the galaxy, a consciousness that should not exist according to any normal rules. Either the biological imperatives of orc genetics or the theological certainties of imperial doctrine. It is an orc that thinks like a human in many ways, while remaining irreducibly alien in others. It is a being of extraordinary physical power who chooses restraint. It is a member of the most violent species in the galaxy who has developed sophisticated moral reasoning. It is evidence that consciousness might be more flexible than dogma allows, that environment and choice might matter more than breeding in determining what a being can become. But Orky is also a being of profound loneliness and permanent liminal status. It will never be fully accepted by human society, never truly understood by anyone who does not share its unique position between species. It must live with constant self-monitoring and restraint, performing a version of itself that is acceptable to others while hiding depths that could never be safely revealed. It exists as proof that transformation is possible, while simultaneously demonstrating the costs of that transformation, the sacrifices required to be something other than what nature designed. The implications of Orky's existence extend far beyond one individual's story. If this scenario reveals anything, it is that the categories by which the Imperium orders reality may be less absolute than doctrine insists. Consciousness appears more malleable than genetic determinism would suggest. Environment shapes development in ways that can overcome, or at least significantly modify, biological programming. Beings designed as weapons can choose to be guardians, and perhaps most unsettling to Imperial ideology, even Xenos consciousness might be capable of developing along lines that make it compatible with human values and society. These revelations carry danger as well as promise. The Imperium's xenophobia, while morally problematic, serves practical purposes in a galaxy where most Xenos species are genuinely hostile and where humanity lacks the resources to distinguish peaceful from hostile aliens in most cases. The simple rule of destroying all Xenos on sight, while brutal, at least provides clear guidance for Imperial forces encountering unknown aliens. If consciousness is malleable, if aliens can potentially be educated or socialized into compatibility with human society, then every Xenos encounter becomes more complex, requiring judgment about whether this particular alien might be redeemable rather than defaulting to immediate extermination. In a galaxy of finite resources and endless threats, such complexity might be a luxury the Imperium cannot afford. Moreover, the project of socializing aliens would require time, effort, and willingness to take risks that might prove fatal. For every Orky that successfully develops human-compatible values, how many others would fail the socialization process and become dangerous? How many humans would die in attempts to domesticate species that ultimately cannot be domesticated? And even if socialization succeeds, how does one prevent educated Xenos from eventually turning against their human educators, using the very capabilities they developed to become more effective enemies? The Imperium's xenophobic policies may be cruel, but they rest on hard lessons learned over millennia of contact with hostile aliens. Yet completely dismissing the implications of scenarios like Orkies would also be a mistake. If consciousness is more flexible than currently assumed, then perhaps humans too could be shaped in ways that make them better suited for the universe they inhabit. The Imperium's breeding programs and genetic obsessions assume that desirable traits must be inherited, but environmental approaches might produce similar or better results. The resources devoted to maintaining genetic purity might be better spent on creating environments that develop desired capabilities in citizens, regardless of breeding. This is not questioning Imperial devotion to the Emperor, but rather suggesting alternative means of achieving the Imperium's goals. For those of us who study and attempt to understand the Warhammer 40,000 universe, Orky's story serves as a reminder that even in the grim darkness of the far future, complexity persists beneath the surface of simple narratives. The Imperium presents itself through certainties and absolutes, through clear distinctions between friend and foe, human and Xenos, loyal and heretic. But reality is messier than propaganda admits. Exceptions exist. Unusual circumstances produce unusual results. And sometimes, very rarely, something emerges that challenges the categories entirely, forcing us to reconsider assumptions we thought were settled. The galaxy will continue spinning. Wars will continue raging. The Imperium will continue prosecuting its endless campaigns against Xenos incursions. Orky's existence changes none of this at any meaningful scale. One Ork, raised by humans in some remote corner of the galaxy, makes no difference to the vast machinery of warfare and survival that characterizes the 41st millennium. But for those few individuals who know Orky's story, who have witnessed what environment and choice can make of biology, the universe becomes slightly more complex, slightly less certain, slightly more open to possibilities than doctrine allows. In the end, we cannot know whether Orky's existence represents hope or warning, success or tragedy, evidence of consciousness's flexibility, or illustration of nature's ultimate triumph despite temporary reprogramming. Perhaps it is all these things simultaneously. A being whose very existence raises more questions than it answers, who forces us to think more carefully about what we assume we know about biology, psychology, consciousness, and the construction of identity. In a universe that offers few comforts and fewer certainties, perhaps that uncertainty itself is valuable, a reminder that the grim darkness of the far future contains complexity and nuance that simple narratives cannot capture. As always, if you enjoyed this exploration into the strange corners of Warhammer 40K lore, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the darkest depths of the 41st millennium. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But even war creates spaces where the unexpected can occasionally emerge if one knows where to look.